Okay, so I sent you, or asked you to look at Freud's 1914 classic on narcissism, and I also sent you The Mirror Stage by Lacan. I did not send you the Kleinian material that I'm also going to review here, but I'll give you the references so that you can easily find what I'm going to be talking about. But let's start with Freud, 1914. One of my favorite papers by Freud, and I'm not going to try and review the whole paper, but I'm going to zero in on a couple of the elements that I think are pretty important. Okay, the big contrast that Freud is making here is between narcissism and object love. And here in this paper, he says something that he usually tries to avoid saying. Freud hated religion, a proud Jew, but he hated Judaism. He hated Christianity even more for good reasons. He was a victim of anti-Semitism. So he usually tries to play down the degree to which he happens to agree with central tenets of the Judeo-Christian worldview. But here he says, in relation to narcissism, we must begin to love or we must fall ill, and we must fall ill unless we are able to love. So there's a statement of his ethic. It's an ethic of love. Puts him in the same camp as the Abrahamic religions, which are so he's defining narcissism as an illness. And he's saying it's something that we need to overcome and begin to be able to love. But notice that he makes the ethic of love subordinate to the medical model. He's not saying love is a good thing in and of itself. He's saying we have to learn to love or we will fall ill. So he's making loving a means to the end of not being sick. He's not just saying love is a good thing in and of itself. It's a utilitarian ethic. If you want to not be ill, you must love. Okay? He's kind of subordinating his commitment to love to a broader commitment, which is a commitment to health. And that's kind of characteristic of Freud. He's constant, and it's characteristic of the whole of psychoanalysis. We're always talking about various behaviors as being sick instead of saying what we really believe, that it's bad. We don't want to say that. We don't want to say it's bad, so we say it's sick. Basically what we mean is it's bad, because the language of sickness doesn't really apply to behavior. It applies to the physiological organism, but it doesn't apply to behavior. In any case, in psychoanalysis, narcissism is bad, it's sick, it's something we need to overcome, we need to learn to be able to love. Okay, he then goes on to state what I think is the most important part of this article. He describes narcissistic love. This falls into the domain of secondary narcissism. Freud believed in primary narcissism. What did he mean by primary narcissism? He meant an initial phase of undifferentiated oneness in which the baby doesn't know where he leaves off and the breast begins. There is no distinction between I and not I. Limitless, unboundaried oneness. He imagined that the infant's experience in that phase is what he calls oceanic experience. We now know this state does not exist. Melanie Klein insisted from the beginning that it did not exist. The Freudians laughed at Klein and said that she was attributing a degree of sophistication to the infant mind that the infant cannot possibly have. The infant research with the split video cameras, one on the baby, one on the mother, and all of these interesting Piagetian style experiments have shown that there is self-object differentiation of a very primitive sort at the beginning, which is exactly what Klein insisted on. It's in Klein's paper of 1952, The Origins of Transference, And I'll just read a paragraph from the 1952 paper by Melanie Klein. She had said this much earlier, but this is a nice little summary. For many years I have held the view that autoerotism and narcissism are in the young infant contemporaneous with the first relation to objects, external and internalized. I shall briefly restate my hypothesis. Autoerotism and narcissism include the love for and relation with the internalized good object, which in fantasy forms part of the loved body and self. It is to this internalized object that in autoerotic gratification and narcissistic states, and she italicizes the term states to distinguish these as states rather than from phases or stages, it's to the internalized object that in autoerotic gratification and narcissistic states a withdrawal takes place. Consequently, from birth onwards, a relation to objects, primarily the mother, her breast, is present. This hypothesis contradicts Freud's concept of autoerotic and narcissistic stages, in italics, states, not stages, which preclude an object relation. However, the difference between Freud's view and my own is less wide than appears at first sight, since Freud's statements on this issue are not unequivocal. In various contexts, he explicitly and implicitly expressed opinions which suggested a relation to an object, the mother's breast, preceding autoerotism and narcissism. One reference must suffice. In the first of two encyclopedia articles, Freud said, in the first instance, the oral component instinct finds satisfaction by attaching itself to the sating of the desire for nourishment, and its object is the mother's breast, and so on and so forth. So what she's saying is that Freud is not unequivocal. He's contradictory. In a few places he implies that there is a relation to an object at the beginning. In other places he posits this state of so-called primary narcissism where there is no relation yet, no distinction made between ego and non-ego, I and not I. That's the predominant view. He drops these occasional contradictory comments, but the predominant view is that there's this oneness at the beginning, which is like a primordial chaos. I mean, it's a very appealing myth, because it's a myth that there's this primordial chaos, and out of this chaos, gradually civilization evolves through the first distinction, self-other, inner-outer, I, not I. And that is like the foundation. And if you biblical. Yeah, it is like yes, Genesis. Out of chaos, Genesis, yes. And so you have this first distinction. Yeah, the waters are separated from the firmament, okay, and then everything else builds on that. And if you don't get that first distinction, you're psychotic, right? If you get that distinction, you've moved out of the realm of primary narcissism into the realm of secondary narcissism, because you say, okay, I admit that I'm not the all and everything. There is a not me world in addition to the me world. So I'm not everything. But everything that's good is me. And everything that's bad is not me. Freud calls that the purified pleasure ego. Okay, you've got the boundary, but the I is all good and the not I is all bad. And then eventually you move on to the third stage where you recognize ambivalence, that the I contains both good and bad, and the not I contains both good and bad. That's what Melanie Klein will call the depressive position. It's the achievement of ambivalence, or whole self and object functioning.
He noted that third position?
Freud? He did. She renames it depressive position, but he called it ambivalence, the attainment of ambivalence. That's Freud's language for Klein's depressive position. They agree on that. Okay, so I'm just talking about primary narcissism. Klein rejects it. I've always rejected it. But in this article, what's most interesting is his theory of secondary narcissism. He's describing narcissistic love as opposed to true object love. What does narcissistic love look like? He says, I'm confusing the object. I'm claiming to be in love with someone, but on examination, the person that I'm claiming to be in love with is simply me. It's either the self that I am, or it's the self that I once was, or it's the self that I wish to be. Okay? I'm confusing my love object with myself, either the self that I am, the self that I was, or the self that I wish to be. So the way I always illustrate this, because I inhabited the university for so long and saw this so often, and I'm going to the other day when I was teaching this material to the candidates, I tried to do it in a non-gendered way, but it spoiled the whole thing. So I'm going to state it in gender terms, even at the risk of being rather sexist, I suppose. But the stereotype example for me is the middle-aged male professor, graduate professor, who falls in love with the 20-something student. And the 20-something student also falls in love with the middle-aged professor. Well, what is she to him? The self that he once was. He's starting to think about aging and death and wrinkles and not as potent as he once was. He's after his lost youth in this young woman. She represents the self he was. What is he to her? He represents the self she would like to be. He's already completed his PhD in 5 books. She's a raw beginner. If she gets him to love her, it's like a short circuit for her. Bingo. It's a hall of mirrors. They don't even see each other. And it usually blows up quickly in a matter of a few months, in which case he's back on his knees knocking on the door, begging his wife to take him back. Okay, so that's an illustration of narcissistic love. It's a hall of mirrors. They don't even see each other. And Freud is saying this is what we have to overcome. I prefer the language of maturity to the language of health, because I don't think health really applies here. Health is a medical concept. But I mean, to be a mature person, to be a good person, to be a mature person, one needs to overcome this narcissism. Yeah.
So that age difference example is, I guess, like a classic kind of exaggerated example. But you could have the same thing happen with the same age people.
You could.
Yeah, okay.
Absolutely. I mean, 2 people are the same age, but she has qualities that he envies, or vice versa. Absolutely. I mean, I would say that this is all. I mean, I think it is very hard to get beyond narcissism. I don't think we're talking here about just personality disordered people. This is okay. We're going to come to Lacan. Lacan normalizes this. Lacan says this is universal. See, Freud has this tendency to speak in sort of like diagnostic categories. Because, and partly the reason he does that is because he's trying to evade Judeo-Christianity. But Lacan is a Catholic. Now, all kinds of people are trying to make Lacan religious. When I call Lacan a Catholic, I mean, he's Catholic in the same way I'm Christian. Lacan and I are both atheists, but I'm a Christian atheist. He's a Roman Catholic atheist. Graham Greene called himself a Roman Catholic atheist. Okay? We're into this. Okay, so what does it mean as an atheist for me to call myself a Christian? It means that I'm deeply rooted in Christian concepts, Christian categories, and Christian philosophy. And I think that in certain ways, Judeo-Christian philosophy understood the human situation better than Freud did. And Freud kind of missed the boat in a way, because Freud naturalized the problem of human evil. He biologized it. He said it stems from the animal in us. He said that, our drives are rooted in the body. He said we're caught in this conflict between culture and biology, between defenses and drives ultimately rooted in a somatic source. It's culture versus nature, and human evil is a part of our nature, and this is the problem. And Judeo-Christian thinkers have always said that's all wrong. And Lacan is the psychoanalyst who rejoins psychoanalysis to Judeo-Christian thought by agreeing that this is not the problem. The problem is a uniquely human problem. It is narcissism. Freud was a theorist of narcissism. He could have made this distinction between narcissism and object love the central human problem. He could have said the whole human problem is overcoming narcissism, the need to overcome narcissism. That is what Lacan does. And in making that move to seeing narcissism as the problem rather than drives as the problem, Lacan rejoins psychoanalysis with Judeo-Christianity without the supernatural, because Lacan's an atheist.
So do you feel that Judeo-Christianity posits that the whole problem is overcoming narcissism?
Absolutely, it does, because if you turn to any Roman Catholic or any Christian philosopher, the fundamental sin is the sin of pride. And all of the other sins follow from pride. Greed, everything else, all of the others. It's narcissism, and of course, in Judeo-Christian mythology, Lucifer is a narcissist. You see, angels are messenger boys. But Satan was not happy just being a messenger boy, a delivery boy. He wanted to take over the company. And he seeks to usurp the power of the Almighty, and he's thrown out of heaven as a result. Right? So again, it's a myth about narcissism, wanting to be the center. So, okay. So Freud has deep insight into the problem of human narcissism. He says we have to learn to love. We have to overcome narcissism. He describes narcissistic object relations, but he seems to confine it. He doesn't make it universal, and he doesn't make it central in his thinking. When you look at human relations, I mean, it is hard for all of us to get beyond ourselves.
Can I argue against that? Because
Sure.
I'm not in the least bit persuaded. When I hear you explain Lacan's idea about narcissism, I'm just thinking, well, fear of death, denial of death. I'm just busy denying my own death.
Right.
And you're confusing that with narcissism, Monsieur Lacan. That's
Well, you're an Ernest Becker guy.
A little bit, yeah.
Okay.
He was also, I think, a Catholic, wasn't he?
I don't know whether he was Catholic or not, but he a very peculiar Catholic if he was, because Becker's argument in favor of religion, I mean, Becker thinks religion is an illusion.
Mm-hmm.
So he's not a believing Catholic.
But what I was also going to say was that if you take seriously the sociological arguments of Christopher Lasch, that we live in a culture of narcissism now, and it has a sociological basis that makes it possible.
Yes.
You can argue back, well, in feudalism it wasn't really likely that very many people were wandering around with narcissistic self-regard. It just wasn't kind of possible in the Dark Ages. They were too busy with other things. So I would have a hard time seeing narcissism as some kind of human universal that you could build a that Freud or anyone else could have built an entire edifice of.
But that's exactly what Catholicism does. That's what Christianity does. And Christianity was certainly there in the Middle Ages. I mean, Christianity is the theory that says that narcissism is the central human problem. I mean, Lacan is just...
Again, I would go to the denial of death argument and say that Christianity was about giving us answers to that problem, and insofar as I have pride, they're simply trying to redirect to the imaginary man upstairs who is going to take care of all of our death problems by promising us the impossible, which is life in the hereafter.
Okay, so I distinguish between the two halves of Christianity. There's the half that diagnoses the problem, and there's the half that offers the solution.
Okay.
And I don't have very much use for much, not all. I mean, to the extent that the solution is getting past ourselves and learning how to love others, I'm with the Christians. But if their solution involves magical thinking about other worlds and rewards in heaven beyond and the man upstairs, I have no use for this whatsoever.
Mm-hmm. Okay, insofar as the loving other, this is great. I'm really, my mind is so engaged with this.
Good.
The loving others part, again, with the fear of death, if to love the other is to risk losing the other, because the other might die on me.
Okay.
Overcoming death is overcoming narcissism in some ways.
Overcoming the
The
fear,
fear of
Fear of
death.
death, yeah.
Fear of death.
Mm-hmm.
So
I'm clear. Sorry.
No. Listen,
didn't wanna take over your
we're going to go
seminar.
far afield here because one whole chapter of my forthcoming book is on Ernest Becker.
Okay.
And the paper is called The Melancholic Existentialism of Ernest Becker. He was depressed. He was dying when he wrote the book. When I first reviewed the book back in the 70s, when it first came out,
Okay.
I said this book should have been called The Denial of Life. It's all about how human beings, how we hate our bodies, we hate our anality because we have to shit, and our needing to shit is a constant reminder of how our bodies are ultimately going to turn to shit, and we are turning to shit, and we are going to die. And it's an extremely one-sided book. First of all, he seems to quickly blot out the fact that we enjoy our bodies, that we even enjoy shitting, and he argues that everybody is afraid of death, and this just simply is not the case. Some people welcome their deaths, not because of magical thinking, that they're going to join their lost loved ones in heaven beyond, but because they've had enough. I'm drawing on the thought of Erik Erikson.
Mm-hmm.
And Erik Erikson argues that if you have had a full life, just as if you've had a full meal, you are sometimes willing to push away from the table, so if you've had a full life, you're willing to say goodbye. You're tired already, and it's time for the next generation to take over. You know,
Usually that's not the sort of person that's on the couch asking this. You know, they're ready and they've come to terms with all of that. But when we're labeling people narcissistic personality disorder or whatever, we're talking normally about a 32-year-old person who's in the middle of all of that and hasn't.
Okay, but that's not what Becker is saying. Becker is generalizing to human beings as such. He's not talking just about anxious, neurotic individuals who have a fear of death. Of course, many people are terrified of death. But you see, part of the genius, here I become Freudian, part of the genius for Freud is, he says in this wonderful passage, none of us have ever experienced death and actually come back to talk about it. He said, so our ideas about death are entirely dependent on our fantasies, including our unconscious fantasies of what death involves. So if death is the ultimate separation, because everybody else goes home from the cemetery and I'm in the freezing ground left all alone forever, that's a fantasy. And if I'm thinking of death as this cosmic abandonment and separation, I'm going to be terrified of death. If, on the other hand, my fantasy is I'm going to revisit. I'm going to find again my lost love or whatever. I'm going to have a completely different set of attitudes towards death.
Right.
If I'm thinking of death as I'm finally getting the punishment for my sins, I kept it secret from everyone. I got away with it. The sinner that I am, that I've been hiding. But death is the grim reaper with his sickle, and he's going to get me finally. The cops are going to get me finally, and this is the ultimate punishment. If that's what I think of death, then of course I'm going to be trembling in my boots and dreading it. But these are all fantasies, and different people attach different fantasies, and I think Becker was in the grip of a very dark fantasy that in Kleinian terms, that book is guilty very much of splitting. I mean, he sees all the dark side, and I don't deny the dark side, but he doesn't see the light side. I mean, there is much to be celebrated in life, and so there's a whole school of thought, as you probably know, following Becker now. It's called terror management theory in psychology.
Sorry, what is it?
Terror management theory.
T-E-R-R-O-R.
Terror
Yeah.
Terror management theory, and it's a whole school of thought. Becker is their hero, and they see they think they've got the key to explaining all human behavior as a defense against terror. The ultimate defense being against death. Death for them is the anxiety. But I think it's a mistake to select one thing like that and call it the anxiety. I think we have a range of anxieties. Freud enumerated in his classic theory a bunch of anxieties. There's the and they each fold into the other. He starts with superego anxiety, because once you've developed a superego, you're afraid you're going to lose the superego's love, and you're dreading an attack by the superego. But just beneath superego anxiety is castration anxiety. And then beneath castration anxiety is the anxiety of the loss of the object's love. And then at the rock bottom is the loss of the object. Freud doesn't include death anxiety in his theory, but he comes close to it with loss of the object. Because if you're an infant and you lose the object, you're dead. You're going to die. That's as close as he comes to it. I think human beings have a whole range of anxieties, and to zero in on one, death, it sounds plausible, but I'm very unconvinced of that. On the other hand, I am willing, with Lacan and Judaism and Christianity and Islam, I'm willing to generalize here and say that narcissism is a universal. It's hard to get past ourselves.
Maybe the narcissism, what Camus says, that we really only have one choice, to kill ourselves or get on with it. And without narcissism, the answer would be, more often than not, to just kill oneself.
I don't know that narcissism would be the only thing that would prevent us from killing ourselves. Look, Cormac McCarthy writes that amazing book, The Road.
Oh, yeah.
And the father could have killed himself, but he didn't do it because he had a boy. And he loved his boy, and he carried on for the sake of the boy. I think we often carry on for the sake of others, not just for the sake of ourselves. Regarding Christopher Lasch, I think it's an important and brilliant book. I agree completely with him that our culture of narcissism is a product of consumer capitalism. I mean, it was productive capitalism that produced a different kind of character with a very demanding superego. This was a guilty man who was driven by guilt. Erik Erikson put it brilliantly before Lasch. I wish I could quote the exact phrase, but Erikson says, the man of the 19th and first half of the 20th century was a man who thought he knew who he was and who he ought to be, but had trouble being it. So he came to psychoanalysis because he was having trouble being who he thought he knew he was and who he thought he ought to be. Post-1950, this new kind of patient emerges who arrives at psychoanalysis because he doesn't know who he is and he doesn't know who the hell he's supposed to be. Okay, so that's a shift, and that's the shift into the narcissistic disorders. But there's a difference between talking about narcissistic disorders and talking about narcissism as a universal human problem. I think medieval man was just as much struggling with narcissism as anyone else. And some medieval people struggled with it pretty successfully and managed to love, and other people got consumed by their greed and their narcissism, and I just think that's...
Is that just the aristocracy, or you think like all classes? Were like
Oh,
that?
I don't think it's a class-based thing. I don't think that poverty makes it any easier for you to get beyond your narcissism. I don't think riches make it any easier for you to get beyond your narcissism. I think narcissism is
Jesus said it was easier for the poor person.
Who?
Jesus said it was harder for the rich person.
Well, he did say that.
Yeah.
You're right. It is as hard for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven as it is for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle. So you're right. He did think it was easier for the poor. But on the other hand, I worry because poverty can brutalize a person.
Yeah.
It can brutalize a person. So I don't know that it's necessarily going to be such a great help. But okay. So I think we have to keep in mind the distinction between narcissism as a universal human problem on the one hand and so-called narcissistic, hi Susan, narcissistic disorders on the other. Another big, so I've mentioned Freud, 1914. Then I talked about Klein, 1952. No primary narcissism, but for the Kleinians, secondary narcissism is simply a quality of the paranoid schizoid position. You know, we have this two-tier model of the mind, PS and D. PS being a more primitive layer of the mind and D being a more advanced. And in the paranoid schizoid position, all of us are narcissistic. We talked about a toothache and how you're going to be completely self-preoccupied with this pain in your mouth, and you're not going to have much time or capacity to think about other people when you're in that state. And in the paranoid schizoid position, the leading anxiety is persecutory anxiety. We're feeling like prey, being hunted by predators, by the all-bad persecutory object. Survival is the issue. We're trying to survive. Our minds are not very much directed towards helping others. It's more a matter of escaping attacks by predatory others. But as we move into the depressive position, again, misleading, the word depressive, it's not about depression, it's about depressive anxiety, which is Winnicott renamed it the capacity for concern. So we move into the depressive position, we come to be capable of being concerned about other people. We start seeing others as whole objects, not just part objects, and we can see the self as a whole self, not just all good, all bad part selves. And this enables us to have concern. So we come out of narcissism. In PS, we're narcissistic. And in D, we have a growing capacity to move beyond narcissism. But these are layers of the mind, not stages. So what Kleinian theory is saying is we all suffer from narcissism. And in this way, Klein, too, is in sync with Judeo-Christianity and with Lacan. And in fact, a lot of Lacanians have come to realize that there have been two big books published called the Klein-Lacan dialogues. And Kleinians and Lacanians have been getting together and realizing they've got a whole lot in common. And one of the big things they have in common is being in sync with Judeo-Christianity, in the sense of making narcissism an intrinsic existential, not just a disorder, but an existential problem that we all struggle with, right? The more able you are to move into the depressive position, the more able you are to overcome your narcissism. But it's a struggle, and we're oscillating for the Kleinians, we're constantly oscillating between PS and D, which means we're oscillating between narcissism and object love, right? It's not a switch that you can throw. This is why apology is necessary, because you may be in love with your partner, but you're going to, at times, let him or her down. You're going to be selfish. You're going to be self-centered. You're going to have to apologize and make reparation for having sunk into one's narcissism. The more mature you are, the more able and the more quickly able you are to dig yourself out of your narcissism. That's the human struggle. Okay, Rosenfeld was a Kleinian, Herbert Rosenfeld. I'm talking about an article he wrote published in 1984, but he was writing about narcissism back in the early 50s. In this 1984 article, let me give you the title of it.
The author is?
Herbert Rosenfeld. Yes, it was in the International Journal of Psychoanalysis, sorry, did I say 1984? I meant 1964. 1964. The title is On the Psychopathology of Narcissism, a Clinical Approach. Now here he's not talking about the universality. Okay, he's talking about what he sees as a particular type of pathological narcissism, a personality disorder. People who are extremely difficult to treat in analysis. He's saying, Freud distinguished between the narcissistic neuroses and the transference neuroses. And Freud said the narcissistic neuroses are untreatable by psychoanalysis. Why? Because psychoanalysis works through the transference. This is how the patient transfers feelings of love and hate from past figures onto us. And we analyze this. And that's how the analysis works. But these narcissistic people don't form transferences, says Freud. They're so wrapped up in themselves. They come in and lie down on our couches, and they go on and on and on and on. I'm trying to stay awake. They go on and on about themselves. What am I, chopped liver? This person is not falling in love with me. They're not falling in hate with me. They seem to be pretty indifferent to me. And the traditional Freudian analysts got very fed up with these people and tended to kick them out of therapy as unanalyzable. Well, Freud said they're unanalyzable. What did Freud mean by this? He meant psychotic patients and people that nowadays would be called borderline and severe narcissistic personality disorders. Unanalyzable because they don't form transferences. Now, everybody in North America thinks this is the great contribution of Heinz Kohut in self-psychology in the 1970s. Kohut says, wait a minute, they do form transferences, but of a very different sort, which he calls self-object transferences. But, Kohut never paid his debt to previous analysts. And here's Rosenfeld in 1964, long before Kohut began to develop his ideas. Freud was so pessimistic they couldn't form transferences, but many analysts have tried to develop methods of analysis which would deal with narcissistic patients. I'm thinking of Velder, 1925, Clark, 1933, later Fromm Reichmann, 1943, Bion, 1962, Rosenfeld, and others. Franz Kohn, in 1940, suggested that the sharp distinction between transference neurosis and narcissistic neurosis should be disregarded. He felt that the transference in the narcissistic neurosis is of a primitive or rudimentary type. For example, there are often serious difficulties in distinguishing between subject and object. The patient confuses self with other. He stresses the role of introjection and projection of destructive tendencies in oral and anal terms in relation to the analyst. That's Cohn in 1940. 1954, Stone described transferences which are literally narcissistic. Freud says it's either narcissism or transference, but now people are talking about narcissistic transferences, which is exactly what Kohut would later call self-object transferences. And these are primitive transferences in which the analyst is confused with the self or is like the self in all respects. Kohut will call that the twinship or the alter ego transferences, where the patient is seeing the analyst as a twin, as very like the self. They can't tolerate difference. Okay, so what looks like an absence of transference to Freud is really a primitive transference, in which there's a whole lot of projection and introjection going on. So here's what Rosenfeld says in 1964. I myself believe that much confusion would be avoided if we were to recognize that the many clinically observable conditions which resemble Freud's description of primary narcissism are in fact primitive object relations. So he's an object relations theory. He's a Kleinian. And there are object relations from the beginning. And so-called narcissistic transferences are a type of primitive object relation in which there's a whole lot of projective identification and introjective identification going on. The patient is putting a lot of himself in fantasy into me and is introjecting a lot of me in fantasy is him. And so there's a bit of a mix-up as to what's him and what's me. But this is something that is brought about by the use of a defense. Yeah.
I've heard two polarities be described, kind of like the narcissist and the inverted narcissist, or the codependent, where the narcissist is kind of grandiose and kind of, I guess, what was the first one?
Extrovert?
Yeah, kind of extrojects or whatever into the other person. Projects into the other person. And the codependent is one who also can't see boundaries, but allows the other, is usually traumatized by narcissists, and will allow themselves to be overcome by another person's will and wishes, and is always trying to please and comply with the other.
Compliant.
Yeah.
Right.
Is that anything that you come across, or?
Well, it's everywhere. It's everywhere. But these things always. Well, sadomasochism is hyphenated.
Yeah.
Okay, so this is just a variant. Dominance. Some people are doms. Some people are subs. If we want to turn to the sexual underground, doms and subs, sadists and masochists. The classic narcissist, the classic, again, to genderize it, it doesn't have to be gendered, it can work. But the classic thing is the narcissistic male has a depressed wife. Why? Because being a grandiose narcissist, he can't ever let himself be depressed. He has to be phallic. He has to be dominant, he has to be strong, he has to be aggressive, he can't feel weak, he can't feel depressed, he can't be sad, so he gets a woman who will be sad and will carry the depression and the weakness for him, okay? And then the story goes that he starts to perceive her as this albatross around his neck, of course. She's dragging him down. What a swinging bachelor life he would have if he could cut free of this albatross wife of his, this depressed thing, that he's saddled with. So he dumps her. Okay, but now he starts getting depressed because he doesn't have a container for his depression anymore. The depression starts leaking back into him. Meanwhile, what's happening with her? She's gone back to school, she's got a job, she's starting to have a life, she's feeling a lot better because she's no longer the target of all of the inferiority and inadequacy feelings that he has been projecting into her. So now he's banging on the door, pleading with her to take him back. Big mistake if she does, because the old system will just reestablish itself. He'll feel better. She'll carry the depression.
In some ways, she's kind of engaging in narcissism. I mean, he's clearly preoccupied with himself, and she's preoccupied with him when they're in the system. And that preoccupation with him is also a loss of boundaries.
Exactly, and she is just as narcissistic. The point is that grandiose narcissism is only one of the two types of narcissism. She is a depressed narcissist. Why are depressed people such a bore? Why do we not want to be around them? Because it's all about them. See, the grandiose narcissist, it's all about how wonderful he is. The depressed narcissist, it's all about how useless he is. I mean, they go on and on and on about what failures they are, how ugly they are, how stupid they are, how whatever they are. Can we stop talking about you? What's the phrase? Come down from the cross, we need the wood, you know, what is it? It's an equal form of narcissism. It's just under a negative sign. Depressed people are totally wrapped up in themselves. They have very little capacity to empathize with other people. We want to get away from them. We also want to get away from the grandiose narcissist. So, you know, two sides of the same coin, really.
But isn't there kind of loss of boundaries where you're preoccupied with the other? Like if you're a victim of a grandiose kind of narcissist where you're kind of like constantly like trying to control and manipulate them in order to kind of modulate your own anxiety, and then you lose a sense of like who you are. So let's say a parent who is a narcissist and sees their child as an extension of themselves.
Yes, yes.
And then that child becomes like hyper compliant and doesn't want to enrage
or
their parent.
hyper rebellious.
Or let's say the hyper compliant one.
Yeah.
And is trying to please the narcissistic parent all the time and is always hyper vigilant of the parent and loses a sense of themselves.
Yes.
And so, but in some sense, they're like still. Well, I'm trying to grapple with this losing boundaries and narcissism, because that second individual, that child, has lost boundaries because
See, I would suggest that your language of loss of boundaries is not helping you understand this.
Okay.
I think that's an extraneous thing you're bringing in here.
You brought it up there, loss of boundaries.
The loss of boundaries. I would say. No, I'm not saying it doesn't happen.
Okay.
I'm not saying that there's no such thing as loss of boundaries, or I don't even like the language of loss of boundaries because it makes it sound total, whereas it's more a matter of degree of confusion of self and other. But here in the examples you gave, I don't really think that we're talking about so much. We're not talking about confusion of self and other. Compliance with the other is not the same thing as confusion of self and other. I mean, I guess they can, but I think what you're talking about is something. So here's the kid. He's got this grandiose father. He's desperate for the father's love and approval. He's bending himself out of shape to be what his father wants. Okay? I don't know that there's necessarily, I would talk about that as compliance. I would talk about it as masochistic submission to the other. I would talk about it as him, definitely, he's not developing a sense of a separate self. He's terrified.
Yeah, that's what I mean.
He's terrified of declaring independence. But then look at what he has in common with the opposite type of kid who has the grandiose father. He goes for rebellion. He's going to be the absolute opposite of what his father wants. He's going to be defiant. But he's equally subordinated to the father, only in the language of rebellion, because rebellion is not genuine separation. It's like people who do black masses. Why don't they just go to church and do a white mass? They're still Catholics. They're just inverting everything. It's not freedom. That's not independent. It's just an inversion, right? So the delinquent kid, he's driven to such extremes to not be what dad wants. But this psychology between parent and child is extremely interesting. Nowhere in Freud is there a single paper where he maps out the kind of trajectory you're talking about. But in fact, implicit in a bunch of his writings, you can pull them together and you can come up with something like that. And I've done that. I've been meaning to publish it for some time. I haven't ever gotten around to writing it all down, but here it is. Here it is. We can talk about it as stages. Now, of course, I don't believe in the infant research denies the existence of stage 1. But stage 1 for Freud was primary narcissism, before there are any boundaries between self and other. So primary narcissism, stage 1, no self-other distinction. Okay? Stage 2, we've got the I, not I distinction now. This is secondary narcissism now. This is what Freud calls the purified pleasure ego. And here is where you're saying, okay, I realize there's a not me world, but everything that's good is me. This is introjection. All of the good from the not me is introjected into the me. And all of the bad that is in the me is projected into the not me. So we've got an all good me and an all bad not me. Purified pleasure ego, meaning an ego, a self that's purified of everything bad or painful, which is all of that is projected. You can see the beginnings of Melanie Klein's thinking here. This is in Freud. Projection and introjection are being used to export the bad from the self into the not self, and to import the good from the not self into the self. That's stage 2. Okay, then comes stage 3, where this is the real breakthrough, where you realize you've got an I separated from a not I, but now you're going beyond the the purified pleasure ego, and you're recognizing that there is bad as well as good in the I, and there is good as well as bad in the not I. In other words, you have achieved the stage of ambivalence. The third stage is ambivalence. This is what Melanie Klein will call the depressive position. You've overcome splitting. There's both a good self and a bad self. There's both a good other and a bad other. That's stage 3. Okay, then, is there a stage 4? Okay, yeah, there is. In stage 3, when you overcome the purified pleasure ego, and you realize there's both good and bad in the self and good and bad in the other, Freud argues that our narcissism is such that we can't just surrender it by saying, okay, I'm imperfect, or everything is imperfect. Splitting is overcome. There is good and bad in everything. That is very hard for the narcissist to accept. So Freud says, in stage 3, in order to accept that, what is created is what's called the ego ideal. And so you're saying, I'm not perfect now, I admit it. I admit that I'm not perfect now, but by God, one day I will be. And that's my ego ideal. So what I'm doing is I'm taking my grandiose perfectionism and kicking it like a football into the future. Okay, now I'm sane enough, my reality principle is solid enough that I see that I am far from perfect now. But I'm not willing to give up my grandiose ideal of a perfect God or a perfect self. So I'm putting this perfection into the future as an ego ideal. And in the meantime, I'm projecting this ego ideal onto God, a perfect being, perfectly omnipotent, perfectly omniscient, and perfectly benevolent. And so my belief in God is a symptom of my refusal to entirely surrender my narcissism. It's a continuation of my narcissism by projecting perfection. And Freud says this is rather useful socially, because if the grandiosity is projected into the other world, it's evacuated out of this world. You know? So instead of everybody running around being grandiose narcissists, it's like a lightning rod. What does a lightning rod do? Instead of burning down the barn, it takes the electricity and puts it safely into the ground. So by getting grandiosity kicked out of this world into the next world, we purge this world of a lot of dangerous grandiosity. So he's talking about the social usefulness of religion here as a way of draining off grandiosity. Now, a Freudian following Freud there would say, the problem with modern day secularized society is that we're deprived of this lightning rod. And so all that grandiosity has come flooding back into this world because people don't believe in the other world anymore. And so we've got all these tin pot dictators, we've got these Donald Trumps, we've got Charles Manson, we've got grandiose lunatics galore, cult leaders all over the place. Why? A lot of that used to be drained off by religion into the next world, but now it's like a toilet that has backed up, and it's all over us. This grandiosity, all over us, and pathological narcissism is running amok in the modern world because it's not being drained off anymore. Okay, so Freud sort of says that about religion. But religion is a function of me projecting my ego ideal of perfectionism onto someone like God or onto someone like Charles Manson or whoever it is. Okay, but that's still stage 3. Stage 3 generates the ego ideal. So what would stage 4 look like? Pure atheism. In stage 4, we give up on God. There is no perfect God. So stage 4 would mean a complete surrender of grandiosity and omnipotence, a complete acceptance that there is no perfection anywhere. Not now, nor in the future. Okay, this is the tragic sense of life. This is a kind of thorough atheism. This would look like something like Jean-Paul Sartre's philosophy. Because Sartre is the philosopher who takes atheism to its ultimate degree. It would be the removal of all omnipotence from the ego ideal. It would be the surrender of any kind of omnipotence, any kind of perfection. You might still have an ego ideal as striving to become the best person you can, striving to become a more loving person, but you would give up on the idea of ever being a totally loving person. Of course, again, this is Judeo-Christianity. See, Judeo-Christianity says, well, certainly Christianity says, even after salvation, we remain sinners. To be human is to be broken and sinful. You can become less sinful, but you can never not be a broken being. So, no, it doesn't mean the giving up of an ego ideal, but your ego ideal is going to be a realistic ego ideal. I can become more loving. I cannot become totally loving. I'm still going to be fallen. This is the doctrine of the fall of man. If you idealize an early object, for Freud, what you're doing is a big part of your idealization is projection of your own narcissistic longings for omnipotence onto the object. I'm just a little boy, but I have the best, most powerful, most successful father in the world. So we idealize him even in the face of all kinds of evidence to the contrary. And then having formed this idealized image, we internalize the image and can identify with it. I think a healthy human being still has an ego ideal. It's just that through psychoanalysis or through life, he has tamed his ego ideal. He's brought it down to earth. He's made it realistic. He's given up on ever being the biggest and the best. He doesn't need to be the biggest and the best anymore. He's happy being good enough, to use Winnicott's language. The mother doesn't have to be perfect. She just has to be a good enough mother. Okay? I mean, it's a matter of taming and modifying, not dissolving or dismantling. An ideal can be a realistic ideal. It doesn't have to be an omnipotent ideal. There are ideals and there are ideals, right? Even after I've becoming very realistic and tamed, I can still have ideals and probably still need to have ideals. Something to, I mean, we continue to want to improve ourselves till the day we die, hopefully. And that involves an ideal.
Can an ideal be to be an imperfect self, to be a good enough self?
To be a good enough self, to be the best self we can,
That could be
knowing
an
that
ideal.
we will always fail and fall short. That's a realistic ideal to have, and I see no reason to not call that an ego ideal. But okay, you were after. Sorry, Michael.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask. I've heard sometimes people say, "What is something moves to an ideal ego?"
Yeah. Hanley wrote a paper called The Ideal Self, and this is very different from an ego ideal. An ego ideal represents a self that I am not yet, but that I would like to be. Whereas an ideal self is an image of myself as having achieved the ideal. The ideal self is I'm believing I've reached my ego ideal. Whereas the ego ideal means I'm far from it. It's still my ideal because I haven't reached it. So they're very different concepts. Okay.
Isn't that the depressive position, like where you've achieved your ambivalent self, where you're...
But I don't. The very concept of reaching ambivalence would not fit the idea of having achieved it. There's a bit of a contradiction there. I mean, if one has reached ambivalence, that's a profound awareness of how flawed one is.
And that would be grandiose.
Well, to say I have achieved my ambivalent self is almost a contradiction of having achieved your ambivalent self. Because if you have achieved your ambivalent self, you wouldn't be puffed up for having achieved your ambivalent self. You'd be just very aware of how flawed you still are. You know, like what fuels the progressive movement? For Freud, there are two fuels. One is just the idea of, and this is a rather biologistic idea, that is that the life force, the libido flows on. Now, Freud had the idea that the libido invests the oral, and then it flows on, and it invests the anal, and then it flows on and invests the Oedipal. So he had this idea of a kind of a developmental timetable that is just fueled the way biological growth and biological development takes place, according to a certain biological built-in template. So that's one. The second, for Freud, the second fuel is reality testing. He's talking about, and these are kind of linked, he's talking about how with maturation of the ego, with growth of the ego, the reality testing function of the ego is improving. The ego comes to be able to test reality better and better. It's able to better and better distinguish fantasy from fact. And therefore, the ego's becoming more realistic. And being more realistic, it's beginning to see that I'm not so grandiose and omnipotent as I thought. I mean, you know, the child goes through a phase. I don't know whether you remember the Popeye cartoons. There was a baby, Sweet Pea. And Sweet Pea would crawl out on girders confidently, and it would fall off the girder, but another one would be going under, and it would land safely on the... And it was, you know, it was never... but it had no idea of the danger it was in. And there's a certain stage of toddlers, the terrible twos, they have no idea their danger. They'll dart out into traffic, you have to run out and get them. They don't know, you know, they don't... But at a certain point, their reality testing kicks in and they begin to realize the danger they're in, and now they're having anxiety. And it looks like a regression, but in fact it's a progression. They realize that the reason they're having anxiety is because they've become smart enough to realize the danger they're actually in. So reality testing improves over time, and that causes major developmental changes to take place. So that's a fuel. that drives development. But I can't answer stuff about like Freud's theory that women are narcissistic and so on and so forth. He has this theory that women don't have a superego. This is all just garbage, really. I mean, this is an area where Freud is just profoundly off. I mean, it doesn't fit the facts. Women, you can make a case that women have much more severe superegos than men do, not weak ones, because what is the superego according to Freud? It's aggression turned on the self. But we know that boys are encouraged to vent their aggression outwards. In sports, fighting, whatever, being little manly guys, right? So they get to vent their aggression out. Girls are taught not to vent their aggression outwards. That's not ladylike. So what do they do with their aggression? They turn it on themselves, which means they have a severe superego, which means they get depressed. So women have a more severe superego. You see, but Freud was never clear what he meant by superego. I mean, we got caught up in thinking that the superego is a moral force. But what does Freud actually say about the superego? It's anything but a moral force. It's a form of internalized sadism, is what it is. And it plays a huge role in psychopathology for Freud. It leads to the self-sabotage, self-limitation, self-castration, all of these things that we see in psychopathology. The superego is suicide. I mean, the superego is a killer, right? That's what... so what does Freud mean by superego? I mean, the big failure is that he fails to distinguish conscience from superego. At one point in 1923, up until 1923, he seemed to be thinking of conscience sort of separately from this thing he was going to call superego. But in 1923, he decided to get rid of the concept of the ego ideal and to get rid of the concept of the conscience. He folded both conscience and ego ideal into the superego. Huge mistake. And in a paper, one chapter of the book, I'm arguing that what we need is we need to have 5 structures: id, ego, superego, conscience, and ego ideal. And they all can be divided within themselves, each, and they can all conflict with each other. And when you count it all up, that gives you 15 conflicts. And analysts have only studied about 7 or 8 out of the 15 because of Freud's poor decision to merge ego ideal and conscience into the superego. If you operate with all 5, you've got 15 conflicts. And now psychoanalysts are going to talk about conflicts between the conscience and the superego. Okay? So my superego tells me that as a loyal American, I'm supposed to protect state secrets. But my conscience tells me, I'm Edward Snowden, I have to blow the whistle. Okay? There's a conflict. Superego is simply what society tells you is right. Superego says to this Islamic fundamentalist, you must fly the plane into the World Trade Center. He's following his superego. Wish he had a conscience. So there's all of these conflicts between the ego ideal and the superego, conflicts between the ego ideal and the conscience, conflicts between the ego and the ego ideal. I mean, the ego is all about rationality. The ego ideal, you should be a good, courageous soldier. How does that fit with your rationality? I'm going to get killed. There's all of these conflicts that psychoanalysts should have been studying, and we haven't been studying them because we haven't had these separate concepts. So there's big problems there. The obscurantism is a kind of an anti-democratic strategy. I mean, Lacan, talk about narcissists. I mean, he doesn't want to be understood, like Nietzsche, he doesn't want to be understood by just anybody. Okay, so he writes in this distancing, patrician style. I mean, you read a few pages of Lacan, and it's as if it's a constant reminder of how you didn't receive the kind of classical education you should have received, because he's dropping references to this poet and this medieval writer and blah, 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 I mean, it's like a museum of European culture to read Lacan. it's but and so I would read 40 pages of Lacan, and then I'd want to throw the book away and dismiss him as a total obscurantist. I would be enraged, but then I'd come across a passage that struck me as sufficiently brilliant or important that I couldn't dismiss it. So I kept going. We had a study group here for about 4 years. We read through A. Cree, but I found it increasingly. I was getting more interested in the clinical practice of psychoanalysis, and I found Lacan just very remote, very abstract, very abstruse, and of very little use in the clinic. It always came quickly to mind when I wanted to do an applied psychoanalysis of a film or of a play. I continued to find it useful, and still do find it useful in certain applied psychoanalytic situations, but clinically I found it of little use. But more recently I've gotten interested in it again. I always recognized the theological relevance of it, and I always appreciated Lacan's placing of narcissism at the center in a way that Freud did not. I think that Freud should have. Okay, the mirror stage. First of all, Lacan makes a mistake. He tries to justify this idea of the mirror stage by pointing to research on chimpanzees and pigeons. Big mistake, because there he's turning to positivistic empirical social science to justify his theoretical concept. Whereas in fact his thought is profoundly anti-positivist. He should have drawn on the Greek myth of Narcissus and stuck with that. I mean, in a way, Freud was more intelligent. Freud draws on Shakespeare. He draws on Sophocles. We talked, the first evening about poetic truth as opposed to scientific truth. Lacan should have been content to have his theory advanced as poetic truth, but instead he starts talking about research. There's a recent article by a research psychologist by the name of Billig, B-I-L-L-I-G. He points out that there really is in developmental psychology, there's no support for Lacan's mirror stage. It's supposed to happen at 6 months. It's empirically not supported very much at all, if at all. Billig also points out that the researchers, the empirical researchers that Lacan gestures towards or cites, he miscites, he kind of a little bit plagiarizes. He's been accused of various academic sins in that article on the mirror stage. But my reaction to this critique is it's kind of irrelevant because the critics think they're nailing Lacan by pointing to these flaws, but they're not nailing him at all because his theory belongs to poetic truth. It doesn't belong to empirical truth. He's advancing a wonderful myth. And I don't think it's entirely a myth. I think it fits our experience. It may not fit 6 months exactly the way that Lacan advances it, but there is truth in this theory. So his idea is that the child starts in this very uncomfortable situation of what he calls le corps morcelé, the body in bits and pieces. He's talking about originary fragmentation. He's drawing here on a school of biological thought that Freud also subscribed to and that Ernest Becker subscribed to. That is, the idea of postnatal fetalization or neoteny. The neonate comes out of the womb premature. This is the theory of biological prematurity. Evolution had a decision to make. It was selecting for intelligence, which meant a bigger brain, which meant a bigger head, and it's hard enough to pass through the brain now as it is. So the solution was to push it through the birth canal before it's fully baked. And so we know that the two fontanelles of the skull have not knitted together yet. The baby's head has to be held. The baby is chaotic. I mean, a newborn colt can stand up in a few minutes or a few hours. The newborn of other species are far more together than the human neonate is. So the human neonate, because of biological prematurity, experiences itself as this chaotic, uncoordinated thing. And at about 6 months, it catches an image of itself in the mirror. And the image looks so cohesive, everything that it is not experiencing itself to be. And it kind of falls in love and it identifies with this image. And Lacan's idea is that this is a misidentification, that the infant actually takes himself to be the image. He confuses the image with himself. And whether or not that is the case, I prefer to think of it as the child falls in love with and idolizes this image. Now here, you see, he's Catholic, and the Bible says, "Thou shalt not worship graven images." So Lacan is talking about idolatry here. He's talking about the idolatrous worship of the self-image. And he's talking about the mistake of identifying yourself with this image and proceeding to worship yourself as image. And this is idolatry, because this is a false self. This is not who I really am. This is an image either in a literal mirror, or it's my image in my mother's eyes, the mirror of my mother's eyes, or it's the image of myself as held up to me by society. Now, of course, I'm a sociologist reading this. George Herbert Mead gives us the two phases of the self, the I and the me. Charles Horton Cooley gives us the looking glass self. Okay, this is exactly what Lacan's talking about, the looking glass self. And Mead gives us the two phases of the self, the I and the me. Now, the I is the subject, and the me is the object. Any self that we know is a me, because it's an object of knowledge, which makes it an object, which makes it a me. Any self I know is an image, and it's always leaving out the I who is doing the knowing of that me. So the I is like the photographer who is never in the picture, because he's always behind the camera taking the picture, right? So George Herbert Mead says there is a constantly unknowable part of the self, unknown, an unknown knower. Now, he's not talking about the unconscious mind, because the unconscious mind has contents that can be known by the Freudian method. He's talking about something more like an existential, like if you want to go Kantian, a transcendental ego. He's talking about a mental subject who is doing the knowing but can't be known. Now, Lacan goes with this, essentially, without citing Mead. I don't think he knew about Mead. But of course, Mead gets it from Hegel. And Lacan did know Hegel to some considerable degree. But so there's an inverse relationship between the specular ego, Lacan's ego is not Freud's ego, right? By ego, Lacan means specular, image. Of course, Freud meant that at the beginning. In the early Freud, Ich stood for the image of the self. It was only later that he started talking about a structural ego, as distinct from his early idea about self-image. Originally, Freud's early theory of repression was we repress that which doesn't fit the image of ourselves. So in a sense, Lacan has come back to the early Freud's view of the ego as an image, a specular ego. But there's an inverse relationship between that and the subject. His theory is that we have fallen into this addictive a preoccupation with the self as image, and because it's phallic, we feel castrated, fragmented, but the image is whole. And we're in love. This is omnipotence. This is wholeness. This is like an ego ideal, an omnipotent ego ideal. And we're in love with this. And to the extent that we're focused on this, we're blind to the subject. We're blind to our subjectivity. We are not in touch with our subjectivity because we're obsessed with this false self. Let's go Winnicottian here now. We could say we are obsessed with the false self and we are blind to the true self. And the true self, for Lacan, the I subject is linked to fragmentation, the baby's original le corps morcelé, the body in bits and pieces. So what is the cure? What is the psychoanalytic cure for Lacan? It is acceptance of castration. What is traversing the fantasy for Lacan? It's traversing the fantasy that I can be this whole object and that I can actually succeed in attracting the desire of the other. So Lacan says, my desire is the desire of the other. Desire for Lacan has nothing to do with anything animal. Freud's basic error was to confuse organic need with human desire. Human desire has nothing of the biological, really, about it. We're also animals, so we have organic need. But the whole of Freudian ego psychology was to confuse human desire with organic need. Psychoanalysis operates on the level of the noosphere, the human, not the animal. And desire can only emerge from a sense of lack. Here again, he's following Sartre. I think he's following Hegel. We desire that which we lack. If we don't feel we lack, we don't desire. So desire and lack are directly linked. But my fundamental desire, according to Lacan, is the desire of the other. I desire to be desired. That's my desire, to be desired.
I want to be adored.
I want to be adored. I want to be the apple of mother's eye. And this is what leads directly into the Oedipus complex, which is not about sex, per se. It can be sexualized, but it's about priority. I want to be number one. And my desire to be number one is thwarted by siblings, as much as it is by another parent. Anything that gets in the way of my desire to monopolize the look and the love of my desired object. So aggression comes not from any kind of a biological drive or biologically based drive for aggression. Aggression comes directly from narcissism. I want to be number one, and I feel aggressive towards anyone who competes or threatens my project of being number one. Aggressivity comes from narcissism. The cure is acceptance of castration. When the patient comes to realize he can't be number one, he can never securely monopolize the position of centrality. I mean, you can get close to it in a really good marriage, where you're both in love with each other, and you're faithful to each other. But even there, I mean, even if there's strict fidelity to one another, she's going to notice other guys, and she's going to be aware that I'm noticing other women, even if I'm not doing anything about it. So you can go a long way towards giving one another this fulfillment in a really good marriage. But even there...
as soon as... I'm thinking of a couple who were very much in love and the apple of each other's eye,
right,
and lived that way for many years,
right,
over a decade, and then they had Sonny Boy.
Then they had Sonny Boy.
And hubby isn't getting his, and she's devoting her love and attention to Sonny Boy, and the perfect dyad is broken by the triadic relation, and it all ended in tears.
Well, look, I mean, the arrival of children can just kick the hell out of the thing. I mean, yes, the arrival of children. But a career. A career can be the third that leads to the envy and the resentment and all of the rest of it, right? I mean, it's very hard to maintain this thing.
Isn't it kind of infantile to even try?
I don't know. I don't know that it's necessarily infantile. I mean, look, the insistence on having your cake and eating it too is infantile. But on the other hand, sometimes you can manage to get, a lot. If you're smart and you make the right decisions, you can maximize pleasure. Are you going to ever eliminate frustration? Of course not. Are you going to ever have it all? Of course not. But you can do better or worse. And I guess it's, if you're talented, you can work at getting the best you can get. And sometimes you can get until something goes wrong. And somebody's going to get cancer. Someone's going to have a heart attack. Someone's going to get hit by a car. I mean, it's going to go to hell. Everything goes to hell. But, you try to postpone things going to hell as long as you possibly can, right?
Deny death.
Well, deny death.
Just to get back to Ernest.
Well, sure,
Yeah.
deny death, deny the other, deny all of the interferences, right. So, yes.
Where does that original fragmentation come from?
Well, for Lacan, again, it's this biological theory that's widely accepted, the theory of prematurity, the idea that we are still fetuses when we are born. We remain a fetus for some months outside the womb, unlike other animal species. Other animal species other mammals are fully baked while they're inside. We come out half-baked.
It's like our eyes, I read somewhere, our eyes don't even focus. We can't even actually see.
Right.
And that's like, our brains are not fully...
myelinized. The nerve pathways of the neurons are not myelinized yet. We're the most radically helpless newborn, and therefore we leave prematurely the biological uterus, and therefore we need to be absorbed into a social uterus, which is the family.
Right.
And we become far more dependent on significant others for sheer survival, and therefore social learning. It's as if, and because of our prematurity, we do not arrive with instincts. We're an instinctless animal. We come with reflexes. We come with a blinking reflex. We come with a startle reflex. We come with a reflex that causes us to go rooting around for a nipple breast. But we don't have instincts the way the bear has an instinct to hibernate, or the way that the salmon has an instinct to swim upstream. And therefore, society has to replace our missing instincts by social programming to a very large extent.
But is that what the fetus or infant experiences, like a fragmented?
Well, that's what
body or
Lacan hypothesizes. I mean, how do we prove? Did we prove that it's true? I don't know. I mean, again, poetic truth rather than empirical truth. I don't know that infants experience. But to me, it's not a stretch to imagine that infants experience themselves as pretty incapable and pretty frustrated a good deal of the time. When you can't reach out for and grab the thing you want, when you can't feed yourself, when you're dependent on some giant to bring the food, and you have no sense of time.
Right. Earlier, in the first half, you mentioned the oceanic feeling, and when you were articulating that, you were suggesting that the oceanic feeling was something that the newborn infant was still experiencing and capable of experiencing outside the womb.
That's
Now,
Freud, not me. But anyway,
yeah, okay, so that you were saying that, but I've always thought that the oceanic feeling was our experience of existence while in the womb and being pushed out in this painful experience
Right.
into the cold world
Right.
was the first, holy smokes,
Yeah,
there's
yeah, yeah.
another.
Yeah.
You know, the oceanic feeling is gone.
Yeah,
It's
yeah.
just the land of the giants and all
There's
of
a
that.
lot of
So-
psychoanalytic support for that. Otto Rank, The Trauma of Birth,
Oh, okay.
but also Béla Grünberger, Hungarian-French psychoanalyst who wrote on narcissism, also talked about the birth as and he associated oceanic with prenatal.
Okay.
But Freud associated primary narcissism and oceanic for some weeks or maybe a couple of months postnatal. He
Right.
thought it continued mentally.
But then there was the fragmentation. Did he have a fragmentation? Like, to get back to your question, Robert, like,
Freud did not speak of fragmentation this way. This is a Lacanian idea. This is not there in Freud.
so for me, it's helpful to think that the experience in the womb is this oceanic feeling of oneness
Yes.
with the universe, and everything is perfect, and then you're pushed out into the cold world,
Right.
and it's fragmented. It's broken up. There's no more oneness anymore. There's just this chaos of
Right.
as yet uninterpretable.
Well, in a certain sense, Bion would almost agree, because Bion says that at the beginning we have all of these raw beta elements
Yes.
that have to come to be alpha betized, have to be subjected to alpha function. Lacan has the concept of the real, and the real is that which is unsymbolized, has not yet been ordered, organized through symbolic function. It's a little bit like Bion's beta elements. It's unsymbolized.
But it's
and-
more sociological? 'Cause alpha function is an internal psychic process.
Right, right. What's more sociological? The real?
The Lacanian, the everything needs to be symbolized. I take that to be a social process of it.
Yes. It's a much more social process. He's talking about a symbolic order.
Yeah.
The symbolic ordering of experience, yes. But still, what you're saying would tend to go along with Lacan's idea that at the beginning there is a terrible sense of fragmentation.
Mm-hmm.
A terrible sense of fragmentation which leads the child defensively to want to escape that chaos and fragmentation into this image of order. And I mean, in Lacan, I think it's also a distinction between castration, fragmentation, and phallus. The phallic being something seen to be powerful, potent, firm, ordered.
That's too masculinist for me, I'm afraid. How does this work for girls then?
Well, it is but Lacan has been criticized for his phallocentrism. There's no particular reason why. I mean, Lacan says.
It's just will to live, isn't it?
Yeah, I think of it in much more general terms than that. Lacan says, I desire to be that which the other desires, and by definition, what the mother desires is the primordial other. For Lacan, by definition, that is the phallus. The mother desires the phallus. Anything that the mother desires, Lacan names phallus. I seek to be the phallus, that is, I seek to be the thing that the mother desires. Well, Irigaray and many others have pointed out that that may fit the codes of a phallocentric culture, but there's no particular reason. And of course, why does he choose phallus instead of breast? I mean, any Kleinian will say the first object of desire is the breast, the good breast. It's not, but the history of patriarchy, of course, is to strip the breast of its primordial significance and replace that with the phallus, to strip the mother and put the father as center. That's what patriarchy is. Lacan is a patriarchal thinker, as was Freud. There's no doubt about that. No doubt. But leaving all of that aside, I still find value in his making of narcissistic omnipotence as the central human problem, and his making the psychoanalytic cure all about breaking through narcissism and surrendering and coming to grips with the fact that I can't be central. And then only then am I.
Where's Lacan's poor penis at the end of that, given that he's put that at the center of his...
Well, he defines the psychoanalytic cure as acceptance of castration. But you see, the thing is that for Lacan, the person who has not read... See, he says there are two cuts. The first cut is the cut that separates I from not I, self from other. The person who fails to register that first cut is psychotic, okay? But if you register the first cut, and you've got inner separated from outer, self from other, you now have to go on to register the second cut, because now you're trying to be the all and everything for the other. You're trying to be what the object desires. And you think you can be. You have the hope that you can be the all and everything for the mother. And if you're stuck there, depending on your reading of Lacan, you're going to remain forever neurotic or perverse.
It's a kind of mama's boy.
Fixated on the mother. The Jungians have some insight into this. They talk about the mother-fixated male this way. But of course, here Lacan's talking about both sexes. The girl, just as much as the boy, has to overcome this idea that she can be the center for the other. For Lacan, the pervert, especially, is described as someone who is still out there thinking he can occupy this phallic position. But because he hasn't registered the cut, what is the second cut? The second cut is registered by le nom du père, the name of the father, or the paternal function. That is, he realizes that mother's looking over his shoulder at father. There is a third. And the third appears in his psyche, and the third is registered in his psyche, and that liberates him from this delusion that he can be the center. The paternal function is to help the child realize he can't be the center. But when the paternal function fails, the child is left with this quest and this belief and this illusion that he can be the center. In other words, the child is left narcissistic. Okay? For Lacan, the fundamental problem is narcissism. Sometimes he seems to apply this more to the pervert. I think, generally speaking, he's applying this to the neurotic. The neurotic is a narcissist. The pervert is also a narcissist. These are people who are stuck in narcissism because the paternal function has failed. They have not registered the second castration. Therefore, they have to castrate themselves. Some of the really interesting Lacanian work, especially on perversion, is about, and I would again extend this to neurotics. They're self-castrating because, for whatever reason, the castration was not accomplished. It's a dirty job, but someone's got to do it. And because it wasn't done successfully, they have to do it to themselves. Therefore, they are self-castrating, self-limiting, self-sabotaging, finding failure, clutching defeat from the jaws of victory. They're doing it to themselves. Why? Because it wasn't done properly.
So you mentioned the paternal function, and I wonder what that is in relation to the Oedipal struggle.
Well,
because last week I think you said that you're damned if you win the Oedipal struggle and you're damned if you lose it.
Right.
So if the Oedipal struggle is something to do with the paternal function, we're in real trouble because there's no way out.
There's no way out, and that is the cure. The cure is to recognize there's no way out. The cure is to recognize that one is castrated.
Nobody gets out of here alive.
What's that? No one gets out of here alive, and we're all castrated. And therefore the cure is acceptance of that. The neurotic is the person who does not accept that he or she is castrated. He's out there omnipotently trying to be the human being who isn't castrated. And this leads him to be omnipotent and grandiose. And it also leads him to need, ironically, to be self-castrating.
Okay, so in a world where grandiose narcissists rule the roost,
right,
how would I survive as this successfully castrated character?
Well, because grandiose narcissists sometimes win. I mean, a grandiose narcissist may press the button and eliminate North Korea from the map. So we don't always win against grandiose narcissists. The Genghis Khan, well, we defeated Hitler. Barely. Sometimes we defeat them. Sometimes they defeat us. But the person who has overcome their grandiose narcissist is someone who's capable of being a sane leader. is capable of pulling back from the brink, is capable of taking and hearing advice that he doesn't want to hear, because he's capable of testing reality, because he can see beyond his narcissism. The reason we're all terrified now is we know that a guy is in the White House who can't see beyond his narcissism, doesn't want to, and refuses to. And therefore, he's a terrifying figure, I mean, one just has to pray that there are generals around him who would say no to him. So what is that? That's praying for paternal function. Hopefully there are some generals. Look, some of those judges stood up to Trump and struck down the Muslim ban. Now that's paternal function. These are guys who said, no, this is against the Constitution. This is not allowed. We're going to say no. Okay, they said no to this child in the White House. Okay, hopefully there are generals, these guys who carry the briefcase with the keys. Hopefully there's someone there, but we can't count on it. Yeah.
I've heard narcissism described as kind of like a ultra kind of response to a very low self-esteem, for instance, or extreme insecurity or something.
Yes, I think that's a dominant view in psychoanalysis. Actually.
Yeah. So how's that come out of some of the stuff we've been talking about?
Doesn't come out so much out of the Lacanian, but in mainstream psychoanalysis, especially for people in the Kleinian tradition, especially for Otto Kernberg being the analyst who most impacted psychiatry, I think, will say that for pathological narcissists, for their therapy to become successful, they have to become depressed. Because their narcissism is a huge defense against terrible feelings of shame, worthlessness, inadequacy, castration. And until that defense collapses and they enter into the depression, the therapy isn't going to. And it's a dangerous moment when
actual depression, like sadness.
Sorry?
Like sadness depression as opposed to...
Well, I would probably say even a serious depression. We're talking about a serious clinical depression that may well be necessary.
It would be catastrophic to lose that defense.
Well, that's the point.
Yeah, like you're holding yourself up like a house of cards, yeah.
And the defense was put together, as defenses always are, for very good reasons. I mean, there was trauma. There was trauma in childhood, and there were terrible feelings of shame and inadequacy in childhood. And so this defense has been constructed. When the defense cracks, there's a suicide risk. And the analyst has to help hold the person during a severe depression. That's a good way to put it. When I first entered the field, I thought I'd be helping cure depression. And I find what I'm doing a lot of the time is helping people be depressed. Helping people be depressed, because that's the way towards a healthier way of being. Oh, of course, that's very similar to Lacan's acceptance of castration. Being depressed. Surrendering the illusions of superiority and centrality.
Nietzsche would just, and I get why you're saying that he's so Christian. Nietzsche would just say, this is slave mentality.
Yes, he would.
And it can't abide it. And although I hate Nietzsche, because I find him
lots of
insufferable, but I kind of want to side with him there, because I am unhappy with the idea that my will to exist is being equated with some kind of narcissistic personality disorder, which requires me to become depressed. That's the equation that I just heard. And
No. No one's equating your will to exist with this. I mean, the will to exist is not in itself an omnipotent narcissistic. In fact, I would say that overcoming omnipotent narcissism liberates the will to live.
Oh, okay.
Because as long as you're captured by narcissism, your will is perverted into the will to be the center and to be the object of everyone's desire, which which prevents you from simply being.
Okay, no, yeah, thank you.
But the idea, see, an omnipotent, grandiose person can't play. They're too busy being grand. They can't be silly, they can't play, they're too full of themselves to be able to play. Playing, Winnicott is the brilliant theorist of play, and playing is linked to being, the capacity to be, which is something that grandiose narcissists don't have.
If you can't lose, you can't play.
That's a good point. If you can't lose, you can't play.